think about the comfort of, well, drawing a line on a map. We rely on those boundaries to tell us where one nation ends and another begins.
Or where a conflict zone stops and a safe haven starts.
Or even where our own personal security is guaranteed. We expect those lines to remain static. But the events unfolding today show just how fragile those boundaries actually are.
They really do.
Welcome to the Clara and Horatio Daily World Brief, available at claraandhoratio.com. Today, we are looking at a historic military advance in the Middle East, the sudden arrival of Russian munitions inside a NATO country, and a high-stakes election in the Americas.
The analytical framework for today really requires us to look past the headlines and examine the sudden disruption of physical and political structures. We are witnessing military forces cross lines that have been static for decades.
And we are also seeing the boundaries of public order, international alliances, and even personal political imagery being aggressively challenged.
Which is a lot to cover.
So let us start with the shifting geography in the Middle East. Israeli ground troops, specifically the Golani Brigade, have captured Beaufort Castle.
Just for some context for everyone, this is a 900-year-old Crusader fortress located well beyond the Litani River in southern Lebanon.
We are now seeing footage of the Israeli flag flying over this medieval structure. It marks the deepest incursion into Lebanese territory in over 26 years.
And at the same time, the Israel Defense Forces have expanded evacuation zones further north, below the Zaorani River.
Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is calling this a decisive shift. Meanwhile, Lebanon's Prime Minister Nawaf Salam accuses Israel of collective punishment, and French President Emmanuel Macron is demanding an immediate end to the escalation.
Well, the temporary ceasefire agreement that was recently in place has effectively collapsed. Both Israeli and Lebanese officials are pointing fingers at one another at this point.
With Israeli leadership citing Hezbollah's continued projectile attacks as the catalyst, I imagine.
Correct. While Lebanese officials point to the ongoing Israeli strikes as the violation, the mutual accusations have shredded whatever diplomatic framework remained. It essentially leaves the conflict to be decided by hard power on the ground.
I am stuck on the imagery of an advanced modern military capturing a medieval fortress. I mean, we live in an era of precision-guided missiles and drones.
And real-time satellite surveillance.
Does physically holding a 900-year-old stone castle actually matter strategically in modern warfare? Or is this victory purely a symbolic message for the cameras?
The military utility and the psychological messaging are, they're basically inseparable here. Symbolically, the weight is immense. The Israeli army previously captured this exact site 44 years ago during the First Lebanon War.
Okay, I see.
Raising the flag there now communicates a message of historical endurance to their domestic audience. But strategically, topography still dictates the terms of ground combat.
Even today. Even today. Beaufort Castle was built there 900 years ago for the exact same reason it is valuable now. It sits on a commanding hilltop overlooking the Litani Valley.
So even with the drones overhead, physical control of the high ground denies the enemy a launching point for portable anti-tank weapons.
It does, and it provides critical line-of-sight control over the surrounding supply routes.
Well, speaking of the threat from the air, the vulnerability to aerial weapons provides a very clear link to the current situation in Eastern Europe. A Russian-designed Shahed drone, which is also known as a Geran-2, struck an 11-story apartment building in Galati, Romania.
And Galati is in a NATO member nation.
Which is a huge detail. The strike injured 2 people. Vladimir Putin publicly claimed there is no evidence the drone was Russian.
However, Romanian President Nicolae Ordan quickly confirmed that the debris perfectly matched a previous unexploded Russian drone found in their territory.
The geopolitical calculus here has to be incredibly delicate for the NATO alliance. It is incredibly delicate. These specific Shahed drones are frequently deployed by Russia to target Ukrainian grain ports. Those ports are situated just across the Danube River from Romania.
So the incident in Galati appears to be a navigational error.
It looks like an accidental spillover from those port attacks rather than a deliberate, authorized strike on a NATO member. This is why Romania opted for a measured diplomatic response. They expelled a Russian diplomat and closed a consulate.
I want to push back on that measured response, though. An apartment building in a sovereign NATO country gets hit by a foreign weapon, injuring civilians. If someone throws a rock through a window, you do not just ask them to leave the neighborhood block party.
That is a fair point.
Why didn't Romania trigger NATO's Article 4 for emergency consultations, or, Article 5 for mutual defense?
The distinction comes down to intent versus accident, and, well, the terrifying machinery of Article 5. If Romania and NATO treat an errant weapon as a deliberate act of war, they are obligated to respond militaristically.
Which risks escalating a localized targeting error into a direct conflict between nuclear powers.
Precisely. By choosing diplomatic expulsion, Romania signals that they hold Russia accountable for the negligence. But they do it without triggering the mass panic and potential global war that an Article 5 declaration would inevitably cause.
You cannot talk about Russian drones hitting NATO territory without looking at the psychology of the man ordering the strikes in the first place. Vladimir Putin's public persona has undergone a staggering evolution over the decades.
It really has. Back in his early KGB days, he was known as the Moth,
The Moth.
a quiet, unremarkable bureaucrat who actively blended into the shadows. Then we had the era of the bare-chested action hero, the man riding horses and flying fighter jets.
And today, his image has shifted into this highly isolated, heavily orchestrated wartime persona, sitting at the end of cartoonishly long tables.
The contrast is jarring.
Was that middle era, the hyper-macho public relations strategy, an intentional postmodern reality show designed to distract the Russian public? Or is this current isolation a symptom of deep, escalating paranoia?
Well, the evolution reflects the changing needs of his regime. In the early 2000s, cultivating the image of a vigorous, teetotaling strongman was a highly calculated counter-narrative,
Because his predecessor, Boris Yeltsin, was frequently publicly intoxicated.
which was viewed domestically as a national humiliation. Putin's action hero phase signaled stability and vitality to a fractured country. However, the transition to his current state points to a profound internal decay of trust.
The extreme physical distance he mandates during meetings, and the heavily sanitized environments.
They suggest a leader who is now deeply suspicious of his own inner circle. When an autocrat dismantles independent institutions, their personal physical survival becomes indistinguishable from the survival of the state.
He engineered a system of absolute centralized control.
And now he is essentially trapped by the intense paranoia required to maintain it.
That dynamic of intense military buildup and internal anxiety is playing out on the other side of the world, too. At the Shangri-La Dialogue Defense Summit in Singapore, Japan's Defense Minister Shinjiro Koizumi stood up and directly confronted accusations from China.
The Chinese Defense Ministry had previously warned the region about Japan's supposed neo-militarism.
Koizumi forcefully rebutted this, pointing instead to China's own.
These citizens argue that building up the military will not deter a conflict. It will simply accelerate the timeline, for one.
And that push for regional deterrence leads us directly into another major announcement. The United States, the United Kingdom, and Australia have announced a £150 million project under the AUKUS alliance to develop uncrewed undersea vehicles, or UUVs, by next year.
This falls under what is known as Pillar 2 of the AUKUS agreement. Pillar 1 was the highly publicized deal to provide Australia with nuclear-powered submarines.
So Pillar 2 focuses on sharing advanced technology.
Yes, like artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and these uncrewed undersea vehicles. The stated objective is to protect vital seabed infrastructure.
Like the undersea internet and communication cables that keep economies functioning.
Exactly that kind of infrastructure. Defense officials have noted a significant, troubling increase in Russian naval vessels operating very close to these lines. These UUVs are designed to conduct surveillance and logistics operations in the Pacific, the Atlantic, and the High North.
I am struggling with the framing here, though. The defensive posture around protecting internet cables makes sense on paper. However, the joint statement explicitly notes that these uncrewed vehicles will also be equipped with payloads designed to conduct strikes.
That is the controversial part.
If you are deploying a fleet of automated submarines with strike capabilities into contested waters, it feels like buying an attack dog and calling it a guard dog. Is this truly a defensive measure, or is this an offensive escalation aimed directly at countering Russian and Chinese naval operations?
You're describing the fundamental paradox of the security dilemma. By developing advanced strike capabilities to secure your own vulnerabilities, you inadvertently threaten your adversaries.
Which prompts them to further militarize in response.
While AUKUS leaders insist the goal is preserving the status quo of international waters, introducing armed, uncrewed technology to the seabed inherently raises the stakes. The ocean floor is becoming a new, highly active domain of warfare, and automated strike vehicles introduce a dangerous new vector for potential miscalculation.
When you are trying to parse the difference between stated diplomatic goals and actual military capabilities, it helps to have a reliable compass. You can find free-thinking daily news and our brain candy rabbit holes over at clarineratio.com.
Looking at how security policies impact internal politics, Colombia is currently holding a pivotal election that will shape global drug policy for years to come.
Left-wing President Gustavo Petro is stepping down due to term limits. He is throwing his support behind Ivan Cepeda, who promises to continue Petro's total peace strategy.
Which involved negotiating ceasefires directly with armed insurgent groups.
They are facing off against conservative Paloma Valencia and a right-wing political outsider named Abelardo de la Espriella. De la Espriella is running a hardline, tough-on-crime campaign and openly expresses admiration for Donald Trump's political style.
The central tension of the Colombian electorate right now revolves around the reality of narcotics production. President Petro's administration claims they have achieved historic, record-breaking drug seizures during his term.
However, data from the United Nations World Drug Report demonstrates that the actual cultivation and production of cocaine in Colombia has soared to record highs over that exact same period.
That is the sticking point for voters.
Wait, how can both of those things be true at once? How do you have record seizures but also record supply?
It is a matter of scale and the unintended consequences of policy. If the total volume of narcotics being produced doubles, law enforcement can seize a larger absolute amount of drugs,
Allowing them to claim a record seizure.
exactly, while the actual percentage of drugs making it to the market still increases. Critics argue that Petro's total peace strategy is the cause. By entering into ceasefires and pulling back military operations against armed groups, the state inadvertently gave the cartels the breathing room and territorial control they needed to massively expand their coca cultivation.
So the incoming president will determine whether Colombia maintains this diplomatic approach to insurgents or pivots back toward a strict militarized security alliance with the United States.
It is a massive turning point.
The tension between state security forces and armed rebel groups is a constant globally. In a brief security roundup, we are seeing the human cost of these groups. In Nigeria, retired Major General Reba Obakar and his wife were abducted by armed gangs in Katsina State.
Abubakar previously served as the military's chief spokesman.
Meanwhile, in Myanmar, a massive explosion in the rebel-held village of Kong Tat, near the Chinese border, killed 55 people. The physical devastation was vast, leaving a massive crater and destroying hundreds of homes.
The incident in Myanmar requires careful parsing of the initial reports versus the established facts, though.
Because in the immediate aftermath, terrified civilians assumed it was an airstrike conducted by the military junta.
Given the ongoing civil war, that assumption made sense. However, the Tong National Liberation Army, the rebel group that actually controls the area, later issued a statement clarifying that the blast was an accidental explosion of materials they had stockpiled for mining and quarrying operations.
You look at these rebel organizations, and they operate almost like highly dangerous, unregulated startup companies.
That is an interesting way to put it.
They require massive amounts of capital to fund their insurgencies, so they frequently rely on illicit or poorly regulated mining operations to generate revenue. They stockpile volatile explosives in the middle of residential villages with zero safety protocols.
And the civilian population tragically ends up as collateral damage in the crossfire of their economic engines.
The devastating consequences of unregulated operations in conflict zones bring us to another unpredictable force that governments struggle to manage: massive civilian crowds.
In France, over 400 people were arrested in Paris following extreme violence and vandalism. This occurred after the Paris Saint-Germain football club won the Champions League final.
Rioters smashed shop fronts and burned vehicles, prompting police to deploy chemical tear gas to clear the streets.
Conversely, in Italy, authorities took a completely different approach to crowd control. They proactively banned upcoming concerts by American artists Kanye West and Travis Scott in Reggio Emilia.
The Italian authorities cited public order and security concerns. They specifically noted the potential for counter-demonstrations stemming from West's previous anti-Semitic remarks, as well as the severe risk of crowd crush given the proximity of the two massive events.
It is wild to see two European democracies handle the threat of public unrest so differently.
We are observing two distinct philosophies of state control here. France utilized a reactive, heavy-handed approach. They mobilized 6,000 police officers and relied on chemical dispersants to regain control of the streets only after the violence had already erupted.
Italy, anticipating chaos, opted for preemptive bureaucratic censorship. They prioritize perceived public safety and the prevention of unrest over the freedom of assembly and artistic performance.
Both approaches highlight the inherent difficulty authorities face in managing the unpredictable kinetic energy of large crowds.
Controlling a crowd is one challenge, but controlling a biological contagion is entirely different.
The medical charity Médecins Sans Frontières has called the rapid spread of the Bundibugyo Ebola strain in the Democratic Republic of Congo deeply alarming.
They are reporting over 1,000 suspected cases.
Adding fuel to the concern, health authorities in Brazil announced they are monitoring 2 isolated patients in São Paulo and Rio de Janeiro for possible infection. I hear the word Ebola, and I immediately think of the 2014 global panic. Should the international community be worried?
We need to parse the medical reality from the alarming headlines to prevent undue panic. The situation in the DR Congo is indeed severe. The Bundibugyo Ebola virus is highly dangerous.
Okay.
But the primary reason MSF is sounding the alarm is that the outbreak is happening in an active conflict zone. The violence prevents medical workers from conducting proper contact tracing and isolating patients.
Which makes containment nearly impossible.
However, the World Health Organization stresses that a global spread remains highly unlikely. Furthermore, regarding the 2 patients in Brazil, the protocols worked, but the diagnoses were different.
The individual in São Paulo tested positive for meningitis, and the patient in Rio tested positive for malaria.
The likelihood of an intercontinental Ebola outbreak remains exceptionally low based on the current epidemiological data.
While human contagions dominate the news cycle, farmers in Western Australia are currently battling a very visible physical plague. An apocalyptic swarm of mice has descended upon the region.
With local agricultural authorities estimating up to 10,000 mice per hectare.
The region had a bumper harvest, which left abundant spilled grain on the ground. Subsequent heavy rains provided fresh young shoots.
This created a perfect storm of unlimited food and shelter, and mice are now ravaging the newly planted winter crops. The economic devastation is profound.
Farmers are spending hundreds of thousands of dollars to replant ruined crops and lay down specialized bait.
The problem is exacerbated by the biological reality of the mouse life cycle. A female mouse can begin breeding at just 6 weeks old, and she can fall pregnant again within days of giving birth.
Wow, leading to an exponential explosion in population growth.
That traditional pest control measures simply cannot contain once it reaches this scale.
The psychological toll on these farmers sounds like an unrelenting horror movie. You spend all day out in the fields fighting a literal tide of rodents, and when you finally go inside your home, you cannot even sleep.
Because of the noise.
You hear the scratching in the ceiling above your bed, and you smell the physical decay of the bait working inside your own walls. There is zero respite.
It is a nightmare scenario for those families.
Before we pull back to look at the larger pattern of today's news, we have a few final items to cover in a rapid roundup. South Africa's national football team, Bafana Bafana, faced severe delays traveling to the World Cup in Mexico.
This was due to widespread visa administrative bungling by their own national association.
In Denmark, authorities had to tow a dead, gas-filled, 40-foot humpback whale ashore.
The carcass was actively decomposing and expanding, creating a severe public safety risk that the immense pressure could cause it to explode on a populated beach.
In Laos, there is a glimmer of hope. 5 of 7 missing men were successfully rescued from a flooded cave system.
Those survivors are now actively assisting rescue crews in mapping the deeper unlit tunnels to locate the remaining 2 men.
In the United States, several musical artists suddenly dropped out of the Trump-affiliated Freedom 250 festival. The artists cited safety concerns and stated they were misled about the explicitly political nature of the event.
In response, Donald Trump suggested canceling the remaining musical acts entirely and hosting a May G rally instead.
Finally, the cinematic world is mourning the passing of Marcy Lucas at age 80.
As the Oscar-winning editor of the original Star Wars, she was handed 40,000 feet of chaotic, disjointed dogfight footage.
And she meticulously crafted the narrative clarity and emotional core that ultimately defined a generation of filmmaking.
When we step back and look at the entire spectrum of events we just discussed, a core pattern emerges regarding the illusion of control.
Human beings constantly build intricate systems to impose order upon a chaotic world.
We capture 900-year-old fortresses to control river valleys. We deploy autonomous underwater drones to protect our communication lines.
We engineer elaborate political campaigns to secure power, and we meticulously edit miles of raw film to construct a perfect, controlled narrative.
Yet, reality constantly resists and shatters that control.
An unpredictable crowd in Paris defies a massive militarized police presence. A swarm of mice in Australia completely overwhelms modern agricultural defenses.
A stray drone drifts across a border and strikes a sleeping apartment building in Romania, or a decomposing whale threatens to explode, despite our best efforts to manage nature.
The systems we build are remarkably fragile in the face of chaos. By the way, if you are looking for slower, deeper historical context on humanity's obsession with building border walls and fortresses to keep that chaos out, I highly recommend checking out the debate candy or brain candy sections on the website.
This leaves us with a critical question to consider. When we spend all our energy and our resources trying to engineer total, flawless security, whether that is through rigid border walls, preemptively banning public concerts, or curating the perfect, impenetrable political image,
Do we actually make ourselves more fragile when the unpredictable inevitably happens?
it is a delicate balance.
It is something to mull over as you navigate the boundaries in your own day. Thank you for joining the conversation. We invite you to visit clarineratio.com for more daily world briefs, brain candy rabbit holes, and classic audiobooks. Take care and stay curious.